Why aren't African immigrants considered a model minority, the way that Asian immigrants are? Not sure if this is related or not, but at my work we have a lot of African immigrants and a lot of Black American-born staff. They don't get along and make comments stereotyping the other group. I don't want to get into an HR headache, so I don't pry. But there is definitely some bad blood there in many cases. Not all. The home where I currently am, both these groups work together with no issues. So, I guess my point is, there is some negative stereotype associated with African immigrants. My AA students would openly make fun of Africans. Other than their skin color, they had nothing in common. I believe the history of Asian immigration has influenced the model minority stereotype. Specifically the Japanese and Chinese immigrants who have faced significant discrimination and adversity in the past, and their successes were used to contrast with other marginalized communities. African immigrants do not have the same historical narrative associated with them. Africans encompass a wide array of nationalities, ethnicities, and cultural backgrounds, which can make it challenging to form a unified stereotype or generalization about Africans as a whole. Like you mentioned, while African immigrants may have higher educational attainment, we still face socioeconomic challenges such as barriers to employment, discrimination, and limited access to resources. Those factors might contribute to different perceptions and stereotypes compared to those of Asian immigrants. Curious where you saw these stats? Nigerians are considered model minorities in the US from my experience. Because the model minority myth exists to pretend that racism doesn't exist and Black Americans are inherently inferior. Because it would fly in the face of "they are different" racism. Among other things, the key difference between African immigrants and African Americans is that to be here, African immigrants already had to be pretty elite economically and in their education levels to qualify for immigration. Alternatively, African Americans and their conditions are the products of 12 generations of enslavement and another 100 years of black codes, Jim Crow. Consider this, and the notion that Nigerians often outperform all other subgroups in the U.S. in education and income overall. They are African, as are African Americans. They are also black, but not black. But black is inferior, right? You can't change the model minority myth with the truth of the matter, because it would expose that it was born out of making sure that Black Americans were to be the lowest of the castes, no matter what. African immigrants, along with achievements of Black American achievement, fly in the face of that. To admit it would expose too much of the intentionality of anti-blackness and anti-African sentiments. Globally and in the U.S., African immigrants are a good example of what average of African Americans might be if not enslaved and repeatedly sabotaged through institutionalized racism. African immigrants came when those institutions were still and are present. However, they didn't have to muscle through them on the soil for 250 years. That wear and tear of battling isn't on them in the same kind of way in a U.S. context. To put it simply, the narrative must be maintained or Western world collapses. It relies very heavily on perception of self relative to others. Everything from the scaling of continents on maps, eugenics, and telling of history, etc. Typo to fix, Americans, when I meant immigrants. Nigerians are the most educated group in USIIUC. Every Nigerian I've met in my career has been insanely well educated from the tippity top schools and Masters Plus. Their culture really prioritizes education, similar to Jewish Americans and, obviously, Asian Americans. I've heard lots of good things about Nigerians and Ethiopians. Personally, I'd honestly say I hear more good things about them than most Asian groups. I've heard less positive things about other African groups. However, mainly Somalis in the US. Although not too bad. And then essentially all of North Africa in Europe. Much worse. It's just that there aren't that many African immigrants in the US. You have some pockets of them in several metro areas, but most of the country don't see them. Compare that to Asian Americans who are present even in the smallest towns usually. 'Cause that wouldn't mesh well with the running narrative of how African Americans are thought of as being less intelligent and lazy. In Vancouver we have many Asian immigrants, and they probably are viewed as a positive for a country. Because they come from an older and financially established country, usually with a dynasty of wealth. So essentially the government likes how they initiate an inflated housing market. I think each race has its strengths and weaknesses, and I believe African or Jamaican whatever. Black people are actually extremely undervalued for their obvious strengths and their resilience. I think some white people are intimidated by their displayed unbreakable spirit. That's something I admire personally, and they have more fun in life. For non-black people, my assumption is because unless an African immigrant speaks with an accent, you can't tell the difference between the two groups. My assumption for black people is that there may be a perception that African immigrants look down on black Americans, whereas black Americans may have a little prejudice based on media from the 90s that negatively impacted their perception of Africans. That and/or they dislike being looked down on when they, black Americans, paved the way for African immigrants to enjoy what they have in American now. That is my 2 cents based on my observations in Americans. I could be wrong. It has to do with the history of Asian versus other immigrant diasporas and laws in America. Although many lower-class immigrants came from China in our earliest waves, when the U.S. began to open its doors to Asian countries, they often only allowed skilled, educated labor to enter the country. Think doctors, scientists, and nurses from places like India, the Philippines, and Japan. This means that much of the Asian population in America had highly skilled degrees and often landed in the affluent upper middle class more times than not right off of the bat. That and the fact that Asian Americans were allowed to attend higher education institutions alongside whites is what led to the creation of this stereotype, and that Asians are generally smart, good at math, etc. This was not the case whatsoever for black and brown people. Most immigration is a result of war, famine, and/or poverty, which is the case for later waves of Asian immigrants mainly from the Southeast. However, by that time the stereotype was already in effect. Because they are black. But people absolutely do try to weaponize their experiences and perceived success against black Americans. Who says they aren't? All the African immigrants I've ever met have been really stand-up people. They are. My understanding is that there is a cultural rift between African Americans and African or Caribbean immigrants to America. Because they have dark skin. Because the model minority status was only pushed to shame black Americans for not being like Asian Americans. You know, the good minority. The one that keeps its head down and doesn't attempt to challenge the status quo. And that's not even getting into how that thought harms Asians who don't fit into it and go against the grain. A lot of African immigrants believe that they will be received differently based on their educational background, until they are treated like they are black, not Nigerian, not Kenyan, etc. Because simply put, a lot of ignorant Americans do not know of and do not care to acknowledge the cultural diversity of Africa, choosing to only see them as one thing. I think of Nigerian parents being utterly terrifying in terms of demanding the highest level of achievement from their kids in a good way.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. TooAfraidToAsk is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.